Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today I want to talk about the backstory behind the US M249 SAW. Specifically, I want to look at the history of 20th century and into 21st century US squad organization and how squad support weapons were actually distributed to the infantry in the smallest tactical units. There's some really cool information here for us to dig in. We'll begin with World War I, because that's the first major conflict that the US fights where there actually are light automatic support weapons to be used. And that wasn't actually the BAR, that would be the French model of 1915 Chauchat. The US went into World War I with not very many machine guns at all. Really the only suitable single user, mostly machine guns, would be the 1909 Mercier guns, light Hotchkiss guns. They weren't very good. We didn't have very many of them, and ultimately all of the US military's machine guns stayed in the US, the ones we had at the beginning of the war, stayed in the US and were used for training. Troops would get to France, and there they would bring their own rifles, but they would be issued French machine guns, mostly. There were a few divisions that were issued British guns, but generally speaking, they're going to get 1914 French Hotchkiss guns for heavy machine guns and 1915 French Chauchat automatic rifles as their lightweight portable machine guns. Now, these would go into a unit organization that consisted of sections. A platoon had a bunch of sections in it, and most of those were just rifle sections, where everybody in the unit had a bolt-action rifle, 1903 Springfield or a 1914 Enfield, or a 1917 Enfield. There was then an automatic rifle section that had a couple of Chauchat gunner teams to assist, to provide supporting firepower. Now, this sets up what will become one of the big dichotomy in how support machine guns are used by an infantry unit, and that is they are either organic, integral to the smallest units of the infantry. Typically today that would be like fire teams, depending on what military you're looking at in the world, 3, 4, maybe 5-man fire teams that usually will have an integrated automatic weapon. The alternative is to have the guns at the platoon or company level, where this is typically done with heavier machine guns that have a lot more infrastructure, they require more ammunition, tripods, the guns are heavier, and there's too much stuff around the machine gun to build it into a small fire team. So in that sort of situation, the example in World War I isn't very good, because the light gun was actually sort of at the platoon level to be assigned wherever it specifically needed to go, and then you had heavy machine guns that were they were in their own machine gun units. Now, by the way, at the very end of World War I, the BAR does start to come into service. It's used in combat for about 6 weeks at the very end of the war, and it takes over the role of the Chauchat. And after the end of World War I, the Chauchats are pretty much immediately dropped from US inventory, and the BAR takes over. And the organizational structure stays the same basically until the very early years of World War II. And that's when the US decides to integrate the BAR specifically into each individual infantry squad. So now, going into World War II, or for the US going into World War II, like 1942, you have a 12-man infantry squad. It's going to have a squad leader, it's going to have a grenadier or two, and it has an automatic rifleman, and that's the guy with the BAR. Now, in theory, this unit could be divided into 2 groups, and the BAR could provide supporting fire while a bunch of riflemen maneuvered. That was the typical organizational structure of most of the armies in the world. The British Army, for example, had Bren guns at the squad level. A squad would have a Bren gun section and a rifle section, and the gun section could lay down supporting fire to suppress an enemy while the rifle section moved against it. The US didn't do that, and was a bit unusual in the generally military structures for not doing that. The thing really with the US military was that we were basically the first military to adopt a universal standard semi-automatic infantry rifle, and the US military administration saw a lot of value in the flexibility and the maneuverability and the lightweight nature of every soldier having an M1 Garand. That gave them a lot more firepower than the most of the other armies out there armed with bolt-action rifles. And the idea was they didn't need this machine gun to encumber the unit with its tripod and all of its ammo suppliers, when instead you could have 12 guys all with, well, 11 guys with M1 Garands, one guy with a BAR. And so the BAR gunner was really not treated as a specialized support weapon. It was a bit of an augment to squad firepower, but wasn't treated the same way as a Bren gun in the British Army, or the fusil mitrailleuse, the 24-29s in the French Army, or the MG-34, MG-42s in the German Army. And this pretty much stayed the same all the way through the end of World War II. Now, the Marine Corps would have a little bit of a different structure. They were often fighting in roles that were a little different with the amphibious operations in the Pacific, but I'm going to focus on the Army here because that's the majority of US military power. Now, what happens at the end of World War II, there are some studies of squad organization, and the US Army starts to look into alternative ways, and they first start to really look at fire teams in the late 40s and early 50s. And it's at this point that the number of BARs by the early mid-1950s, the number of BARs starts to kind of be pushed up a little bit. And the idea is, well, if we put 2 in a squad, we can have 2 separate squads. Each one has some integrated suppressive firepower of a BAR. That'll help things out. But right about the time that they start seriously thinking about treating the BAR as more of an important support weapon, giving it more priority, the M14 is adopted. That's 1957, and the M14 is specifically intended to replace both the M1 Garand and the BAR. The concept is the M14 is higher capacity. It's got 20 rounds instead of 8. It's got the same capacity as the BAR. Really, replacing the BAR with the M14 is kind of seems a bit obvious in hindsight there. Originally, there was the full auto version of the M14. There's a brief period where they were considering adopting the M15, which would have been a heavy-barreled bipod-mounted M14. But even without that, the M14s have selector switches, and the idea is every man has this fully automatic rifle. All of a sudden, we don't need the BAR. It's superfluous because everyone's got this firepower, and we got a lot more firepower in the whole squad by giving everybody M14s. Now, about the same time, the M60 is adopted, and it's easy to assume that the concept would be that the riflemen have M14s, and then you have like a SAW gunner, a squad automatic weapon, and an organic machine gun in the small level rifle squad that is an M60. They share ammunition. They're both 7.62 NATO, right? Well, no, actually. The M60 was treated like the platoon or company level machine guns of World War II. It was treated like a Browning 1919 and used as a separate organizational element that could be attached to rifle squads where necessary, which is fine, but practical experience during the Vietnam War showed that the M60 really actually tended to work better when it was brought integrally into the unit. The only downside is there is a lot of stuff that you have to carry. The M60 really does work better as a 2 or 3 man team operated gun than with just a single gunner. But a lot of times the sort of unofficial organization in Vietnam would have an M60 integral to a unit of riflemen, especially, of course, the M14 goes away fairly early in Vietnam. By 67 or 68, you have a lot of units of just M14s and grenade launchers, and there was no attempt to have any sort of integral automatic support weapon with the M16 units. So you're kind of back in the same, the idea is the M16 is a machine gun. It fires fully automatic if you want it to, and thus it can provide, like, you've got all the automatic firepower you need. In reality, the M16 does not have, and neither did the M14, have the capacity for sustained supporting fire that a purpose-built machine gun like the M60, or going back, the Bren, or the MG-34 or 42, it doesn't have the sustained fire capability of those guns. And by the end of Vietnam, once we get into the early 1970s, further studies on what had just been done in Vietnam, the Army started to realize that an organic automatic weapon in the rifle squad would be a really valuable thing. And they actually do, this is a place where the Stoner 63 is used in a number of organizational experiments. And the Stoner 63 proves to be a really good blend because it provides a lot of the level of firepower of an M60. It's smaller caliber, but you get the belt-fed sustained fire capability. It's got changeable barrels, it's got heavy barrels, it's got bipods. But it's a gun that can be pretty effectively operated by one man. It's a lot lighter than an M60, and it's this really nice balance. And there is a movement. There are some study groups that seriously suggest adopting the Stoner 63 for this purpose. Now, they don't. What they end up doing in the 1970s is issuing out a request for a squad automatic weapon. And that is what brings us to the SAW, because FN sees this, and FN's working on developing a lighter weight counterpart to its FN MAG machine guns in 5.56, and that becomes the SAW. And when the US Army adopts the SAW in mid-1980s, for essentially the very first time, the US goes to this organizational model that had existed previously with a lot of other armies, where the rifle squad has an integrated organic machine gun, and that's the SAW. So that remains the basic organizational structure of the US Army to this day, where you have riflemen, some with grenade launching capability, and an integrated SAW, automatic rifleman or support machine gunner in the individual rifle squad. Now, what's interesting here is first off, we've got two things that are changing on this as the US military goes forward. On one side, we have the Marine Corps, which has decided to get rid of the M249s in its unit and replace them with M27 individual automatic rifles. And they're essentially going back to the World War II concept of every man has the same rifle, they're all nice and lightweight, we get better flexibility and better mobility because there's less extra stuff that has to be carried to support the support weapon. And there is an argument that the Marine Corps makes that the more accurate, precise fire of the M27, which is essentially an HK416, it doesn't have the volume of fire of a 249 SAW, but it has much more accurate fire, and that is more useful and more relevant than volume of fire. We will see in potential future conflicts if that's actually the case. I don't know. This is one of those things that, I mean, well, we can see it's gone back and forth in the US military, it goes back and forth in other militaries as well. Interestingly, the British military has recently basically pushed the 249 SAW out of its rifle squads and instead brought back the FN MAGs as sort of an optional support weapon. So that's the Marine Corps. Then we also have the US Army looking at the new XM7s and XM250s in the 6.8 by 51 millimeter cartridge. And I have no clue what is going to happen on that. I'm not even going to try to make any predictions. But of course, if the US Army does go to a standard cartridge of 6.8 by 51 with a new rifle and a new support weapon, it's going to definitely change or present the opportunity to really change up this concept. And even if they retain the same organizational structure, the XM250 is definitely going to be a heavier, bulkier weapon than the 249 SAW just by virtue of its larger, heavier ammunition. So it'll be interesting to see what the Army does with that. Frankly, it'll be interesting to see what the US Marine Corps ends up doing with its sort of universal standard service rifle that's the same for everybody. There's still a designated automatic gunner in the Marine Corps squads, but they don't actually have a different gun. They just have a different conceptual role to fill with their M27s. One of the things I think we have to look at when assessing small arms development is, what was this gun intended for? Which is not always the same as how it's actually used, and it is often doctrinal requirements that drive specific firearms development requests. And so part of understanding whether a gun is good, bad, or indifferent is understanding what role it's developed for and what role it's actually used for. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. Thanks for watching.